Hi, college. Okay, now it's time to move on to triads and first and second inversion. We haven't spent much time talking about writing the diminished triad, that is, the 7 diminished triad. So, as if there wasn't enough to remember, we cannot double the leading tone. In diminished triads, we want to double the third. So let's take a look here. In most cases, you will see that diminished triads will be in first inversion. So here's our musical example. Let's answer some questions. What key are we in? Well, based on the Roman numeral analysis and the last chord, it appears as if we're in the key of C minor. The diminished triads I've circled in red, and we have a 7 diminished 6, 7 diminished 6, and a 7 diminished 6. So question 2, what inversion are the diminished triads in? Hopefully you said first inversion. What gave that away? The 6 did in the figured bass. So let's spell our diminished triads. In the first one, we have a D, D, F, B. I can rearrange those into superimposed thirds. So my diminished triad is a BDF. And the D is in the bass, which is the third of the triad, which is why I have the 6. It's very important when you have to provide Roman numeral analysis that you include the diminished symbol for your 7 diminished chords. So if we take a look at each voice part, we can answer question 3. What chord tone is doubled in the circled diminished triads? Well, we have the third doubled. The D is doubled. So in the first example, in the first circle, we have the D doubled by the tenor. Where is the D doubled in the second example? Up here in the soprano. In the third example, the D is doubled in the alto. So in diminished triads, we'll see them in first inversion, and we'll have to remember to double the third. So let's head back to our questions. Number 4, in almost every case above, what does the leading tone resolve to in the next chord? So out of this diminished triad, in the key of C minor, which one is the leading tone? Well, the B natural is. So in the first example, our diminished triad leading tone resolves to C, which is tonic. In the second example, our tenor is singing the leading tone and it resolves up to C, which is tonic. In the third example, our leading tone is a B natural and it resolves down to G, which is sol, or the 5th of the 1 chord. So in almost every case, that's 2 out of 3 above, the leading tone resolves to tonic. And number 5, when can a leading tone not resolve to tonic? As in the third red circle above, the leading tone does not have to resolve to tonic when it's in an inner voice. This case, the tenor. Okay, so now let's try this activity. Let's identify chords in 4 parts. First, we'll take a pitch inventory and figure out what notes are in the chord. Then we'll rearrange them and stack them into 2 superimposed thirds. Then we'll analyze them, as I've done in the example. So now, let's get a full screen going, and let's look down here at this first one right here. Identify the chord tones, A, F sharp, D, A. If we rearrange those into two superimposed thirds, we realize that our triad is D, F sharp, A. So let's go down here and build our triad for the first chord. Then we can analyze it and realize that the A, or the fifth, of that triad is in the bass. So this is actually in second inversion. That's a 6/4. This next one we have E, G, B, E. My triad is spelled E, G, B with an E in the bass. So that's a root position triad. In the next one I have a G, C, G, E flat. If I rearrange those into superimposed thirds, I become C, E flat, G. And the G is in the bass, which is the fifth. So this is a chord that's in second inversion, 6/4. The next one looks like I have an E, B flat, G, and that should be a B. Flat. So I've got E, G, B flat. The E, or the root, is in the bass, so this is a root position triad. Moving right along, C, A, that should be an A, things are a bit off today, A, E. So I've got an A, C, E triad with a C in the bass. That's first inversion, so that's going to be a 6. Okay, so you get the idea and where we're going with that. So we need to be able to do that. Very, very important. Let's move on. In this chapter, we're going to be discussing part writing with triads in first and second inversion. We'll talk about illegal motion. We'll talk about figured bass, as we kind of did in the last frame with the 6 and the 6/4. Okay, and we'll also talk about how to voice lead for triads in first inversion and second inversion, and the diminished triad, which we touched upon a little bit earlier. With the diminished triad, we always want to double the third and write it in first inversion. Let's take a moment, AP, to read this together to learn why parallel fifths, octaves, and unisons are illegal. In four-voice harmony, voices ideally should have as much independence as possible. For this reason, certain intervals moving in parallel motion have been avoided in traditional tonal music. These are parallel octaves and unisons and parallel perfect fifths. Why? Well, remember, we are writing four-voice harmony. So when two of the four voices move in parallel octaves or unisons, the effect is that of reducing four voices to 3. Parallel fifths, while not as blatant, were avoided probably for the same reason. Let's talk about some additional things to avoid melodically. We want to avoid augmented intervals in any individual voice. We also always want to remember to resolve the 7th scale degree, which is the leading tone, or T, to the tonic in the same voice. T should go to Do. Remember, the leading tone is an active or tendency tone, so it has the tendency to resolve to the nearest chord tone, that being a half step up, T to Do. And when I mention this, I'm talking about if we have to part right for a 7 diminished chord going to a major or minor 1 chord, let's say. So here I have a C harmonic minor ascending scale, and here's the interval that we want to avoid when we part right in the same voice. We don't want to have an augmented second. In this example down here, this progression, the sopranos are singing a B flat to an F sharp. That's an augmented fifth. We want to avoid that. That's not very wise for the sopranos to sing, and it's quite difficult. So that is also forbidden. Okay, so there seems to be a problem here with this harmonic progression, so we have to try to figure it out. So let's figure out what the problem is. I seem to just figure out the problem in the nick of time. Okay, so what happens here is we're in the key of C minor, And our first chord is a 2 diminished 6-3. The 6-3 indicates that it is in first inversion. Our triad from root to fifth is D, F, A flat. That's why it's diminished, and we need the circle there. But the F is in the bass, or the third, so that's why the 6-3 is present. In the next chord is the 5 chord, and it's a major 5 because our figured bass has a natural sign, so we're looking at G, B, D. Okay, that's a root position triad, and we know with root position triads that we should double the root. In this case, we should double the G. Well, in this second measure here, the G is not doubled. The D is doubled, so that's the whole problem there. So the altos went up from an A flat to a B natural, and that's the augmented second interval that we want to avoid, because that's forbidden. So how would we fix that? We can rewrite this chord here, and let's bring the tenors down to the B natural there. Don't forget our natural sign. That way, the altos could sing a G and double the root, while the sopranos sing a D. Now we have to go back to this first chord and compare that with the new one we just wrote and make sure that we don't have any illegal motion. So as you look carefully at all the intervals, it's as if we do not have any parallel octaves or parallel fifths to worry about. And so that's how you would resolve that to avoid the augmented second. So hopefully you discovered the problem as I did. Let's talk about resolving the leading tone. Remember, the leading tone likes to travel to tonic, so it's mainly going to resolve to the tonic, but it can also resolve to the dominant. In the example A here, this is a good way to resolve the leading tone when we go from the 7th scale degree to the 1. Like we're in a 7 diminished triad going to, let's say, major 1, like for the key of C. Example B is also good. You can have the 7th go down to Sol, or the 5th of the tonic triad. What we want to avoid is C, because we never want the leading tone to go up to Mi, or the 3rd scale degree, in the same voice. So that's important to remember. It is, however, okay if the voice is moving up or down a scale, like so. So if the upper three voices, avoid leaps larger than a 4th. A 5th is okay sometimes, but we really shouldn't be part writing leaps larger than a 4th. So here are 2 measures containing the same notes, just written differently. One is written bad, one is written better. So the bad example is the first measure because the tenors are leaping by that of a 5th right here. That's a large leap. That can be avoided. In the second measure, this is a better way of writing it because each voice part is moving less than a 4th. The sopranos are moving by a 3rd, the altos are moving by a 2nd, the tenors are moving by a 2nd, as is the bass. Now all I did between the first measure and second measure was switch the alto and the tenor. So instead of the altos singing an F sharp, the altos is singing a D, and instead of the tenors jumping all the way up to this high D, the tenors are going to this F sharp. And then you can double check all of your part writing rules and find that you are not breaking any as far as parallel unisons, parallel fifths, parallel octaves. When you are writing bass parts, you do not want to write augmented leaps in the bass part. You want to try to keep the bass moving so that intervals don't exceed an octave, although they can, but never augmented intervals in any one individual voice part from chord to chord. So let's do a quick review. We want to avoid the following when we part write. Avoid parallel fifths, avoid parallel octaves, avoid parallel unisons among 2 voices. Avoid augmented intervals within one voice, and avoid leaps more than a fourth, except for the bass. Always remember to resolve the leading tone appropriately. The leading tone being 7 and 1. 1 would be great to go from 7 to 1 to do. Another way would be from going from 7 to 5 occasionally. And the one we want to avoid is having the leading tone T going to Mi. So let's try to figure out what's wrong with these triads and how we can fix them. Okay, so remember down here I have root position triads. So let's identify the notes really quick. Looks like 2 C's there. Can you see a problem in the first triad? Well, in root position triads, we want to double the root. In this particular case, the fifth is doubled. So we can bring the tenors perhaps up here instead of singing the G in order to double the root. What's the problem in the second triad? Well, it looks as if we have voice crossing, because right now, the way my stems are, the altos are singing higher than the soprano. So we want to make sure that we don't have any crossed voices. So we could notate it like that. And the root is doubled by the tenor. What's the problem in the next one? We have voice crossing between the tenor and the alto. The tenor has gone above the alto. That's also forbidden. The problem with the fourth measure, there is way more than an octave here between the tenor. Well, no, there is no more than an octave. That actually is an octave. It appears as if it's larger than an octave, but that's an octave, so that's technically that's allowed. So that's not the issue there. The issue here is that there's a missing fifth. The other issue I kind of have with this is the soprano note is really, really high and out of vocal range for SATB writing. Sopranos do not sing high Cs often, more often in solo repertoire than in a chorale style. So we would need to add a G here at some point and think about revoicing to bring the soprano down a little bit more. And what's the problem in the last measure? Well, it appears as if our root is doubled. I see 2 C's, but the stem direction is a bit off. We want our stem to go down for bass, up for tenor, down for alto, and up for soprano. So that's how we would fix some of those triads, and you have to be really careful and be on the lookout when you part right. Now we need to do 2 things here. We have to identify the doubled chord tone as the root, third, or fifth for each measure, and also identify each chord as root position, first or second inversion. And I will use abbreviated figure bass for that. So, how fast can you identify all these notes? The quicker you can do this, the better off you'll be. Rearrange them in order to spell the triad. What's doubled in the first example? The G is. That's the fifth. In the second measure over here, what's doubled? The F is. So that's the root that's doubled. In the next measure, the root is doubled, the E. In the next measure, FAC, I see 2 C's, so the fifth is doubled. In the last measure, ACE, I see 2 C's, so the third is doubled. Now underneath here, I will identify each chord as root position, first inversion, or second inversion using abbreviated figured bass. C, E, G with a G in the bass. That's the fifth is in the bass. That's 6/4 inversion. There's no abbreviation for that. You must write 6/4. Root position. Abbreviation, we can leave it blank. If we wanted it full, we would do 5/3. Like so. The next measure, the root is in the bass, so that's also 5/3. In this last example, we have an ACE triad. The E is the fifth, which is in the bass. So that means that this triad is in second inversion. So that gets a 6/4. And that's how you would do that.